after several years of absence. This is a lunchtime meeting, and this particular lunch is a two-course meal. The main dish is EU as a global actor, but there's a small hors d'oeuvre, which is about, which some of you may have picked up a paper, which is entitled Britain, Ireland and Schengen, Time for a Smarter Bargain on the Visas. This is something I published a few months ago, and I thought it might be of interest to some of you here because I was originally observing the apparently increasing cost, economic cost, in terms of tourist and international business in general for the UK, of the self-exclusion from Schengen, in which the kind of iconic example of it is the plane load of Chinese group tourists who come to do Europe, and they get their Schengen visas, and they skip the UK because they don't want to be bothered to get another visa, which I can quite sympathise with in the circumstances. And this, and Ireland is sucked into this by the same token. And so, as you all familiar with British politics, more or less, you know the present British government is not going to join Schengen. However, the question is whether there can be a smarter deal. And I came to the conclusion that there was no reason, real reason, why, if these costs are assessed realistically, why one could not have a request by Britain and Ireland together to make a cooperation agreement with the Schengen area for mutual recognition of each other's visas. And in the course of doing this, I became aware that is precisely what Ireland has done unilaterally with respect to the United Kingdom. And so you're already ahead of the game. And I imagine that there'd be no problem at all for Ireland to follow through with this proposal if Whitehall and Westminster could be persuaded to move. Now, maybe in this future Olympic year, 2012, the sensitivity over these kind of problems will mount. And actually, I was contacted last week by a journalist of The Economist newspaper who is actually writing an article on the subject for next week. And I'm not quite sure what she's going to write, but she may help open up the subject matter. So that's at the end of the hors d'oeuvre, and so I go on to the main course. Okay, first of all, the context. The context for this business is obviously you want me to go there?
No.
So,
no, if you want to change it, you just aim at it.
Oh, I've got to aim at that, yeah. Okay, well, I'm not. So the context is obviously extremely difficult with the Eurozone crisis, which is extraordinarily serious, deep, and dramatic. And unless the resolution to that comes pretty fast, the whole of the House is going to be in even bigger trouble. But I would say that we should view this business of the EU as a global actor as a long-term game in any case, 20, 30, 40-year game. Speaking personally, I've been more or less in this Europe business since the Irish and British and Danish accession in 1973, so almost 40 years, 35 to 40 years. And we're talking about systemic developments, major systemic developments for a serious development of the EU as a global actor. And if it's tough at the moment for propositions of this kind, well, we have to make up our own minds as to what is the rational, inevitable course of the history of European diplomacy going to be. And there's some important things to say, which I'm going to go into. But it's not all long-term stuff either. One question, of course, is if the Eurozone crisis is resolved through a new treaty for the Eurozone members, as to whether there will be an urge to say, some you can hear them saying, Paris in particular, let us focus on those member states who are really willing, in general, politically as well as economically, to go far ahead, and indeed Germany too. The question then would be whether this foreign policy business should be clustered around the Eurozone or whether it should be kept to the EU 27. Well, my response to that would be, well, if that's what our leaders are going to do, that will finally tear apart the European Union completely. And then we're in an entirely new game. And then, on the other hand, you can remark that the Eurozone member states are not conspicuous for their unity in foreign policy matters, as we have observed over Germany's position in relation to the Libyan war, for example. So, for the moment, I would take absolutely the opposite view, saying the Eurozone crisis is terribly serious and has to be resolved, but this is all the more reason why the EU should try to get its foreign policy show reasonably on the road and not to make the linkage between the two. The Eurozone crisis, of course, is terribly serious, and the whole problem is because our great leaders didn't accept the advice that Professor Martin O'Donoghue and I and some others offered in approximately 1978 in a document called the McDougall Group Report, which some of you may be aware of vaguely, which was all about what basically Berlin would call the transfer function, or the fiscal union, or transfer union. So, Martin, we went into that in great detail, but that was forgotten, and now we see its cost up to a point. Well, that's an aside. Now, let us get into the main business. Okay, European diplomacy, a long and noble tradition. Hans Holbein there. And then even earlier, there's this one, which is rather interesting. This is Marco Polo presenting his credentials in Dadu, the then Beijing, in 1266. Europe's first global ambassador. It's an absolutely impeccable performance of the United Europe presenting itself as one in Beijing. And then we now fast forward to 2009, and now we're in Copenhagen, the infamous climate change summit, where the Europeans had a very effectively united position on substance, but the organization of how they presented themselves was like this, and the result was this, namely the famous or infamous meeting of the BRICS and Obama alone, with the European Union not present. So this is, I'm afraid, a perfect illustration of the costs of the obsolescence of today's European diplomacy. So I'm mainly going to talk about how European diplomacy should be restructured in a legal as well as a bureaucratic and political sense. So the question is, why should this be done? A cost-benefit analysis on the functioning of European diplomacy these days reveals hugely expensive duplication. As you mentioned, I was in Moscow, and so to this day in Moscow we now have 28 European Union embassies with delegation, and all of them are writing their confidential notes, mostly copied out of the Moscow Times, as to whether Putin's popularity is going to continue to slide or not. So, dear European taxpayer, you can pay for that 28 times over if you feel rich enough and magnanimous enough for the career of all of the diplomats to do so. However, these are tough times budgetarily, are they not? And I become aware in conversation over lunch that the Irish diplomatic service is on a kind of no replacement paradigm. That's to say, when somebody retires, no, is not replaced. So I guess that means something like 2 to 3% attrition per year in reduction of the costs. And even Sweden is doing this. The richest and biggest budget surplus country has cut its embassies, bilateral embassies in Slovakia and Slovenia, and also in Brussels, they abolished the embassy to Belgium. The Belgians complained of it, and so they said, no, we haven't really abolished it. We have a man in the permanent representation who's the ambassador to Belgium. So these Swedes, they're quite tough-minded people, and maybe they are sending a message to everybody. So punching below weight, it's obvious, it's massive, in spite of this huge cost. And then, in addition, what is happening in the world? The content of diplomacy is becoming much more global regulatory policies. For an American account, Anne-Marie Slaughter of Princeton University has written an excellent book that some of you may have seen called The New World Order. It's all about the center of gravity in substantive diplomacy going into the area of regulatory policies where the European Union has big competencies. And I would say also, frankly speaking, what are our Irish or British or French or Lithuanian national interests in Sri Lanka? Okay, here are a few statistics of it. Let's take the staff numbers. You can't quite read that clearly, but the EU 27 member states employ 93,000 people, alongside 27,000 for the United States, and then the UK, France, and Germany are at about 22,500 each, 12,500 each. I'm sorry. So those major member states are about 4 times as big as the EU External Action Service. There's a total numbers of staff, you've got the local agents, etc., but the story doesn't change very much. So there we are, we have 3,000 embassies worldwide. How many of them do you really want to pay for, ladies and gentlemen, taxpayers? Right, now the Lisbon Treaty was meant to be about getting a world-class European diplomatic service. So how's this been working out? This is what I'm going to go into. In fact, the starting point is not that bad. I mean, so I'm going to go into the legal aspects now. Yes, in preparing this book, it required quite a lot of research work, and so I think I hope it's considered a useful reference. We went into the European Commission's treaties database and discovered that the European Union has signed 249 multilateral treaties and 649 bilateral treaties. Many of these multilateral treaties, I guess Tom O'Dwyer was partly responsible for commodity agreements and that sort of stuff. You know about that, yeah. So many of them were relatively small, specialized affairs, but still, this is legally binding conventions of international law, but they're not all only the olive oil convention of 19-something or other. Many of them are more important than that, and we will go into them in a moment. So, but then the question is, what is the status of the European Union actually in the multilateral organizations of the world? In the small commodity agreements, the EU is properly represented normally, of sometimes the only contracting party and the only spokesperson. And Tom nods his acquiescence. But then mostly in international organizations, status is way behind substance of competence. So now we're going into this legal stuff. Treaty of Lisbon at least clarified the competence structure of the European Union, as I'm sure all of you here are aware, cleaned exclusive competences, but then this huge mass of shared competences, a list about this long. It's really everything except for the exclusive competences. And they are subdivided between what we may call hard shared competences, agriculture, energy, internal market, justice and home affairs, environment, business, where the EU finds itself being contracting party to international legal business, but alongside the member states. And this leads into this very messy business of who represents the European Union in the area of shared competences. The Treaty of Lisbon didn't sort this one out, and in the first year post-Lisbon, there have been a lot of mucky intra-European diplomacy over who should speak for the European Union, as in this Mercury International Convention, where standoff between the Commission and the Member States as to who to speak resulted in nobody being able to speak for the European Union at the Stockholm International Conference. The Belgian presidency of over a year ago actually was impeccable. This, by the way, this is Belgium. I like living in Belgium very much. As you know, we haven't had a government for 538 days in Belgium. However, they managed, the non-government managed their Belgian presence in the European Union extremely well. I think even there's a Belgian diplomat here present. Is that right? So I don't want to embarrass him. Anyway, the point was here whether the dear member states of the European Union, how many of the foreign ministries were saying on the quiet, on the side, actually this Lisbon business was a bit of a mistake. They went a bit far. I think we should use loose provisions to claw back competence for our member state diplomacies and fight over every small procedural issue that is open to controversy. And I would say most of the member states I would criticise for this. I would criticise the British most of all, who've led the clawback procedure, and this has been consuming a disgraceful amount of time for the last year and a half. However, the objective principles, I would say, are clear. Where the EU is a contracting party, it has to be properly present in the governance of the convention or the international organization, either exclusively in the exclusive competencies or with member states where they are also present. You can have virtual membership status, I mean, in our argument, that is to say, an enhanced observer status, where the organization is not acting in a legally binding manner, UN General Assembly often, and OECD, for example, but where there are hard, legally binding matters at stake, then the EU has to be fully present. At the moment, it is an ordinary observer in many cases where it should be more present. The precedent for how to do this exists under the name of Regional Economic Organization. The term is already used in WTO and FAO. Tom, right? There the EU is present, or the European Commission has been present as full member, and many commodity agreements as well. But the full use of this recognized precedent is way lagged behind the reality of EU competencies, and in international air transport, IATA, and International Maritime Organization, to take, these are two perfectly clear cases where the European Union has major operational, legally binding competence, and where the member states will haggle in the antechambers of the general assemblies of these organizations to impede the process for the European Union to become a full member of these organizations. And that is irrational and deplorable in any reading of the European interest. Now, a few important cases that have been moving in the last year. The UN General Assembly, I guess many of you, certainly the diplomats here present, are aware that the EU a year ago made a push to have enhanced status at the UN General Assembly. It went almost to a vote. It was clear that they were not going to get a majority. This came as a terrible shock to the European diplomatic corps at large. How can it be that this wonderful European Union, the embodiment of global enlightenment, could not get a majority vote in the UN General Assembly? The conclusion drawn, correctly drawn, was that the European External Action Service and the member states needed to work harder at lobbying. And they got to work, and they did work energetically at lobbying. And so the second time round, at the beginning of this year, it passed almost on a unanimity basis. And so the European Union now has enhanced status, the UN General Assembly, bit in the category that the Palestinian Authority would like to have. I open a parenthesis on the Palestinian Authority. The UNESCO case, of course, it was operational a few weeks ago, and there the member states distinguished themselves by dividing three ways. 1/3 of them were for yes, and 1/3 of them were for no, and the 1/3 were for abstain. Here, ladies and gentlemen, you have 27 diplomatic corps who are all expensively defining their preferred position on Palestinian representation in UNESCO and dividing in every conceivable direction. This is, what should be the adjective? I would say it's pathetic. And all member states ought to use this case as something to blush over. We are all paying for our 27 diplomatic corps and engaging in this diplomatic dance at UNESCO at great cost to all of our 27 bureaucracies, to the point of you all being irrelevant and enhancing the lack of respect that the rest of the world will have. So please, the call would be wake up over this sort of business. Now, the next case, important case, is the IMF Executive Board. And I understand from the press, but I haven't seen this officially yet, that actually the Commission in its Eurozone governance package has now got the courage to say, actually, in the IMF, there ought to be a single Eurozone seat. This was discussed, I know, but it's not generally known, between France and Germany a few years ago, when I believe that Germany was willing to have a single Eurozone seat and engaged in negotiation with France, who in the end concluded that this was a sufficiently serious threat to contagion in UN Security Council that they preferred not to. And so it didn't happen. But instead, last year, we had this very painful period of trying to reconcile or try to get European Union's overrepresentation in IMF in the Executive Board into line with the global trends, with the rise of the BRICS. And this also was a very, very serious learning example for the European Union. And I'm not sure how far we have all absorbed this. But there was impasse there. The Europeans were refusing to budge, and I think the Dutch were the most obstinate of all, but not alone. And our dearest and nearest ally, the United States, said after a while, look, chums, our dear European friends, you realize what is going to happen. If there's no agreement on how to revise the board, the default position is that the number of seats on the board reverts to about 3 less than the present board. And in accordance with Article something of the statutes, the 3 who are ejected are the 3 that have the least weights, which include India and Brazil. So delicately managed, impeccably managed US diplomacy said, look, dear friends, do you wish to be responsible for throwing India and Brazil in the year 2010 out of the IMF Executive Board. So that knocked heads together a little bit to the point of getting this half-baked compromise where the Belgians and the Dutch and the Spanish agreed to some half-baked solutions, and that was enough for the time being. However, things have moved on. The drama now is that Eurozone could do with a few hundreds of billions of dollars from IMF and behind IMF other rich states. Oh, but the IMF cannot lend to non-states. But monetary unions, according to the statutes of the IMF, can be present on the board if the monetary union members agree to it. So the legal political infrastructure is potentially there. And this is something that, well, it should happen sometime. Okay. World Bank is not dramatic like the IMF, but it's the same story. EU largest international aid donor and not on the board of the World Bank. Council of Europe is currently an interesting case. Treaty of Lisbon resulted in the accession of the European Union to the Convention of Human Rights of the Council of Europe. Basic rules, and so the Strasbourg Court becomes the supreme arbiter of human rights in anything that the European Union should do. Okay, normal rules of the game. If you accept the jurisdiction of the court, you have to enter into the governance of the court. That means that the European Union has to be a full member of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe and able to appoint a judge to the court, etc. And these proposals actually are currently being negotiated. Maybe somebody in the room knows exactly where it's got to, but I believe that is in the course of being settled in a rather quiet way. But it's a very good example of how to rationalize or bring up to date the governance structures in relation to the legal competences of the European Union. But there are many other cases. I've mentioned IATA and IMO already, but these other cases, many other cases amongst the 249 multilateral treaties. So that's basically my story. Now, another critical remark towards the present stance taken in the Council of Ministers of the European Union by our member states. They said, yes, welcome to the European External Action Service, and we suggest we attach to this the concept of budget neutrality. That means the budget is frozen, basically. So we look forward to your full development of your role in the world, but on zero growth in your budget. This is such an absurd proposition that they, after a while, changed the language and said they must move towards budgetary neutrality. This comes back to the figures I was showing early on. I mean, what in the 21st century should be the structure of European diplomacy? It is today grotesquely obsolete and excessively expensive, with a lot of national diplomats doing nothing but engaging in, up to a point, bureaucratic protectionism. Of course, they're doing things which are necessary, but even the visa business, of course, can be Europeanized for the Schengen area and should be, and it's beginning to happen. Of course, you have to have commercial interests to pursue, but on the other hand, how far are national diplomacies really effective mechanisms for commercial sales? Well, it's up to a point, yes, but you shouldn't overdo it. So, dear friends, this is the issue. The EU, according to its competences, a post-Lisbon Treaty, should, in any rational world, be more properly represented. there has to be a big shakeout in national diplomacies, and I know in this painful budgetary period this is happening under the force of budgetary compulsion more than, if you like, seeing this European thing develop. But at the same time, we're in this world where even our major member states are, frankly, not very influential in global affairs unless they unify their positions. So this is a story which is not very timely. Well, it is very timely. Not very timely in the sense that the mood is very bad at the moment. And is the Eurozone going to crack up? And that's the end of Europe, says Chancellor Merkel. Okay, so the Eurozone thing has to be sorted out, whether it's the European Central Bank or the Euro bonds or some hybrid of the two that will be the solution. That has to happen fast. But in any case, so that has to happen. Right. Otherwise, the game is over. Mm-hmm. But that will happen, I suppose, because the cost of breaking up the Eurozone is too big. And so it'll happen sometime in the near future. And at the same time, for the next 20 to 30 years, this progressive development and upgrading of the EU's role as a global actor needs to be pursued. Thank you.
Thank you much.